For 8 seasons during the 1960s, The Andy Griffith Show was the TV show to watch. It was a show that the entire family could sit down and enjoy together. And wouldn't you know it, sometimes there was even a lesson or two that you could learn in between all of the chuckles. For most people these days, it might seem like Andy Griffith could do no wrong. I don't think it is much of an exaggeration to say that the show, with his name on it, is just as popular today as it was when it first aired. And most folks are also aware that Andy had another hit with the TV show Matlock in the 80s. But did you know that there was a time when things weren't going all that well for the much beloved Andy Griffith? Well, it's true. So maybe we should start here with a little movie called Angel in My Pocket. As much as I love this film, and I really do, Andy perceived it to be a failure. The movie in many ways felt exactly like the kind of thing you might expect from Andy Griffith. It wasn't exactly like the Andy Griffith Show, but it felt familiar, if you know what I mean. This movie was meant to be the first of 3 films for Universal, but Andy was so disappointed in it that it became the only one that he would make as part of that deal. For years, he had this nagging feeling that he needed to do something different, and Angel in My Pocket? Well, it wasn't different enough. So when Andy had a chance to return to TV, he jumped on the opportunity. Especially because the show that he would headline appeared to be that shift in a different direction that he so desperately desired. And yes, that is Rob Reiner with Andy there. The TV show was called Headmaster, and it debuted in the fall of 1970, and it's likely that many of you have never heard of it. Or maybe some of you have just chosen to forget about it. But regardless of which camp you fall into, here's a bit of a reminder.
This is our school. It's a co-educational prep school, and I'm the headmaster. That's like a principal. Since all of our students are teenagers, we're going to try and deal with many of the situations that young people come up against these days. And in all of these stories, there'll be a combination of comedy and drama. We have a football team. They practice and they play, and they enjoy it. Our team's never won a game. Our coach is Jerry Van Dyke. Our caretaker and confidant is Parker Finley. This is where I live with my wife. She also teaches at the school. So you see, we won't always be involved with school problems because we have our family life to tell about. We're on every Friday night on CBS.
As the fall preview issue of TV Guide put it, Andy Griffith has chosen a completely new role and setting. He didn't, however, select a different name. Andy still played a feller named Andy, but this time instead of Taylor, his last name was Thompson. And the show was actually a pretty interesting mix of comedy and drama, and Andy elected not to include a laugh track, which was actually a pretty darn bold move for the time. The show tackled contemporary issues like sex education and drug use, and wouldn't you know it, it wasn't a huge hit with the Mayberry crowd. While the first episode won its time slot by the time the show's 3rd episode rolled around, it was no longer among the Nielsen Ratings top 40 TV programs, and it was coming in 3rd against competing shows on ABC and NBC. If you thought that I was going to say that Headmaster was Andy's biggest failure or biggest mistake, you'd be wrong. Because I think what he did next was his biggest failure. He gave up on the Headmaster and the idea of doing something different. In a January 1971 Chicago Tribune article by Clarence Peterson, Andy calls Headmaster a $3.5 million mistake and talks about returning to a role similar to the one that had made him most famous. Again, he was going to play a warm and folksy Southerner by the name of Andy Sawyer. This Andy is the mayor of Greenwood, North Carolina, a town that I would imagine is not all that far away from Mayberry. And just like that, just a few days after the article, the new Andy Griffith Show debuted on CBS. In that first episode, Don Knotts made an appearance as an unnamed but awfully familiar character.
How you doing?
I declare, how did you know I was here?
Are you kidding? I read about it in a Raleigh newspaper.
No kidding.
Yeah, it was in a column about show business.
Show business?
Yeah, said you were going to be the acting mayor. I just made that up.
That's good.
Yeah, it's pretty good,
That's
huh?
really good.
Acting mayor and Chelsea.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
George Lindsay and Paul Hartman actually played the same characters that they played previously on The Andy Griffith Show and Mayberry RFD. I've actually talked at length in another video about this show. It's really like a bizarro Andy Griffith. At first glance, it seems like an episode of the show that we all know and love, but upon further inspection, I just gotta say it's an absolute mess, even with the always lovely Lee Merriweather, yes, Catwoman herself, taking on the role of Andy's wife on the show. Even though the show did its best to follow the tried and true recipe of Andy's earlier success, this show would not make it past episode 10, and it has never been released on DVD or broadcast on television again. In fact, to Andy's chagrin, after the network decided to cancel the new Andy Griffith Show, they returned to airing reruns of Headmaster during the summer of 1971. So with all that said, we know that Andy did manage to turn things around. After Headmaster and the new Andy Griffith Show, Andy made the very wise decision to focus on making TV movies, and his choices were often against type. Yep, unless it was a Ritz cracker commercial, it was likely that when Andy turned up on television, it was in a role that was very different from the wise and warm sheriff of Mayberry, North Carolina. And when Andy did eventually return to making a weekly TV show in 1979, it was again a very different kind of show, and even though salvage ones run on ABC wasn't all that long, the show is still admired to this day for its innovative and original storytelling.
Monday, Harry's got to free his FBI rival from a dictator's firing squad.
We'll blow this place to smithereens.
Salvage 1.
So end of the day, giving up on Headmaster and trying to flee back to the safety of the new Andy Griffith Show was indeed a huge failure for Andy Griffith. But the lessons learned helped him successfully navigate his career for the rest of his life. And you know what? For that very reason, I suspect looking back at it all, Andy probably wouldn't have changed a thing. At least that's what I'd like to think he'd say if he were still around. So there you go. Now it's your turn. Do you remember Headmaster or the new Andy Griffith Show? Please share your memories in the comments section below. And while you're at it, if you enjoyed this video, click on the thumbs up icon. And what the heck? Why not consider whether or not you'd like to subscribe to my channel? I talk about music, movies, and mostly television from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, the good stuff. But most importantly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.